Good morning. We'll call the committee order. Apologize for being a little bit late. We were back-to-back hearings this morning from 9 to 10 and then from 10 forward, so there was a little transition time. But thank you very much for being here. We're here this morning as part of our continuing discussion of irregular warfare and how we design our national security defense apparatus to deal with the changing threats that we face. The basic principal threat being that we now are most likely to face our main threats from non-state actors and terrorist groups. And we are moving into the debate of the next defense budget, which talks a great deal about where we should be spending our money to meet this threat as we evolve forward from the Cold War days and the notion that we should be prepared to fight two major conventional wars at the same time, to the idea of how we confront many different terrorist organizations in many different areas, principally interested in counterinsurgency tactics. But there are many, many implications for policy and budget that we need to work out as we go forward to confront this threat. And we're very lucky today to have four experts in these fields to tell us a little bit about what they think we ought to be doing so that we can get ready for the budget cycle. I have a full statement which I will submit for the record, but I'll leave it at that so we can get to the witnesses as quickly as possible and turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Miller, for any opening statement he might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely, we all await this budget cycle to see the details of Secretary Gates' vision in the fiscal year 2010 defense budget. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today and yield back. I would ask that my statement be entered in the record as well.
We will do that, and thank you very much. With that, we'll turn it over to our witnesses. I will introduce all four, and then we'll just work our way left to right. If you could try to keep your statements somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, we will then get into questions after that. First, we have Dr. David Kilcullen, who is a partner in the Crumpton Group, LLC, and a senior fellow at the EastWest Institute and a member of the advisory board, Center for a New American Security. Also was very, very involved in the counterinsurgency campaign that was developed in Iraq. Look forward to hearing your testimony. Dr. Frederick Kagan, resident scholar, the American Enterprise Institute, also regularly testifies before the Armed Services Committee, has done so about Iraq and other national security policies as well. Always a pleasure to see you. Dr. Michael Lund, Consulting Program Manager, Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity from the Woodrow Wilson Center. Good to see you as well. Dr. Lisa Schirch from the 3D Security Initiative Director, Professor of Peacebuilding, Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. Thank you all for being here. Look forward to your testimony. Dr. Kilcullen.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me, and I'd just like to take a moment to thank your professional staff for being so incredibly flexible over the past week while I've been sitting on my ass with flu, not swine flu, just the regular old humankind.
Did that make it better that it wasn't part of the great threat?
I'd like to focus my opening remarks mainly on counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare, because there's a lot of expertise in other areas at the table, and I'd like to just give the areas that I'm most focused on. Since 9/11, I have fought and worked alongside some incredibly professional and brave American men and women from the Department of Defense, from aid, state, justice, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Homeland Security, in theaters right the way across the war on terrorism, from Iraq and Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Horn of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, and even Latin America. So I'm offering these comments as a non-American, but one who's seen a really incredible process of adaptation and improvement across all the branches of the U.S. government since 9/11. And I think that's something that you and they should be very proud of. Regular Army units, that is conventional standard infantry, artillery, or cavalry units operating on the ground today, have techniques and capabilities that only existed in certain special forces units in 2001. And special mission units have capabilities, as you well know, that only existed in Hollywood in 2001. So we've seen an incredible development, adaptation, and improvement. We've learned a lot of lessons on the way, and we still have some lessons that I think we need to lock in as we go forward. So let me focus on two areas. One is the best practices for counterinsurgency, and the other is surrogate forces in unconventional warfare. In my written testimony, I've listed what I consider to be the 8 key best practices, and I just want to run through them very quickly. The first one, and the most important, is that to be successful in counterinsurgency, you need to have a political strategy that builds government effectiveness and legitimacy while marginalising insurgents, winning over their sympathisers, and co-opting local allies. That is the most important thing. It was our most important weakness in Iraq and Afghanistan going in, and fixing that has been one of our most important successes. The second key best practice is that you need a comprehensive approach that closely integrates civil and military efforts.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just you said Afghanistan. Did you mean Iraq in terms of fixing it and just one of our most important successes, or do you mean Afghanistan?
I think actually both. Much more so in the cases of Iraq.
Okay.
But in Afghanistan, I think we're on the right track to getting a viable political strategy, in the sense of what kind of Afghan government do we want to see? How do we want that Afghan government to function? What are the steps we are going to take to put that government in place? That's what I mean by a political strategy. Not so much a US political strategy, but a strategy on the ground for standing up the government that we're trying to support. So then the second best practice is a comprehensive approach that integrates civil and military efforts based on a common diagnosis of the situation and a solid long-term commitment to the plan. The third is continuity of key personnel and policies, and people having sufficient authority and resources to do their jobs. The fourth one is population-centric security, which is based on presence, on local community partnerships, on making populations self-defending, and on small unit operations that keep the enemy off balance. The fifth one is queuing and synchronization of development, governance, and security efforts so that the three work in parallel together to generate a unified effect. The next one is close and coordinated and genuine partnerships between intervening coalition forces and the local communities on the ground. The seventh one is strong emphasis on building effective and legitimate local security forces, with the emphasis on local. And then the final one is a region-wide approach that not only deals with the insurgency in the country where it's manifesting, but also tries to disrupt insurgent safe havens, control borders and frontiers, and undermine terrorist infrastructure in neighbouring countries. We can expand on each of those if you'd like to in Q&A, but my observation across all the theatres where we've been operating since 9/11 is that where we have applied those best practices, we've done better than in places where we haven't. So I think there's some pretty good empirical evidence on that is the way to go. These are basically lessons relearned. We already knew this stuff in the 60s. We almost deliberately forgot it after Vietnam. But the next category is something that's a little different, which is the use of surrogate forces. And I guess there's a cautionary point here that we sometimes learn the wrong lessons from campaigns that we conduct. And I want to take you back to 2001 when we did the lightning-fast 7-week campaign to topple the Taliban. After the end of that campaign, Secretary Rumsfeld said that we'd engaged in a transformational campaign that basically changed the rules of warfare. And he focused on the use of small, light footprint special operations forces on the ground, backed by precision air power. And that was sort of his description of what the recipe was for success. General Franks, who commanded the force, also said that ISR, coming from space-based and high-altitude and also unmanned systems, was critically important. And he said in his memoirs that he had the kind of godlike perspective that Homer gave to his heroes based on all that. He was obviously very pleased with his performance in Afghanistan. I want to agree with both those points, but I think that they weren't actually the main reason why we succeeded in Afghanistan. On 7th of December 2001, when the last Taliban stronghold fell, which was Kandahar, we only had 110 CIA officers and about 300 US Special Forces operating in that part of Afghanistan. But we had 50,000 Afghans fighting on our side against the Taliban. That, I think, is the real reason why we succeeded in 2001. I've talked to hundreds of Afghans on the ground since I've been working in the field since 2006. None of them has ever described to me what happened in 2001 as an invasion. They always talk about, we kicked out the Taliban and you assisted us. And I think that the use of surrogate forces and building partnerships with local communities was actually the critical element of our success in 2001.
And how did that happen so fast? Sorry to interrupt, but pre 9/11, these forces were out there, but they really weren't making much progress. And then in a matter of, gosh, like a month and a half after 9/11, was it as simple as, the Afghan warlords saying, we see which way the wind's blowing, and it's blowing against the Taliban, so we're going to go against them? Or what made that rapid change?
It was an extremely conscious approach based on a CIA campaign plan of winning and generating partnerships with local commanders. And I wasn't on the ground with those teams, but my boss was, and he's told me in detail, and we have published accounts of how they operated, where they essentially dropped in by helicopter, established relationships with people, identified what their critical requirements were, and were able to back them up rapidly, whether it be medical supplies, blankets, food aid, and so on the one hand, or a JDAM to clear away a Taliban position on the other. So a full spectrum approach of clearing the obstacles out of the way of our local partners and bringing them on side led to basically a cascading series of defections from people who'd supported the Taliban and groups in the civil society coming alongside US forces, leading to that success. I want to point also to Al Anbar in 2007, where pretty much exactly the same thing happened, where we had enough forces on the ground finally to make people feel safe enough to turn against Al-Qaeda. And once we were able to enable that, we had the whole of civil society on our side, and we were able to push Al-Qaeda in Iraq out of that province relatively quickly after years of failure, based on building a population alliance with people on the ground. So the arithmetic of local security forces is actually very important here. We do not have, and we will not ever have, enough forces to generate that sort of dominant 20 counterinsurgents per 1,000 head of population, which is the sort of theoretical number that people talk about. But if you generate local alliances, you can really radically compensate for that lack of forces. Let me give you an example, and then I'll finish on this point. Imagine that we had 50,000 US troops to put into Iraq in 2007, extra troops. We didn't have those, but imagine we did. If we had put them in, we would have had a benefit for that 50,000 troops investment of about 10,000 out on the ground at any one time. Because you have to run your headquarters, you have to look after your lines of communication. That takes about 20,000 troops out of your 50,000. And then the remaining 30,000 have to be on a rotation plan. They've got to be out patrolling, but then resting and then preparing. So you only have about a third of those guys out on the ground at any one time. So the bang for the buck is 10,000 out of an investment of 50,000. Now let's put an alternate possibility. Instead of putting 50,000 US troops in a theatre, we recruit and gain on our side 50,000 Iraqis, which is actually what we did. Instead of getting a benefit for your investment of 10,000, you get the full 50,000 out on the ground all the time. There's no headquarters, no lines of communication, no rotation plan. They live there. So you get a benefit of 50,000, but actually it's more than that, because those 50,000 guys who work for us used to be in the enemy's recruiting pool. They used to work for the enemy. So the benefit is a net benefit of 100,000. We gain 50, the enemy loses 50. So the benefit of recruiting and employing local security forces on our side is 10 times the benefit of putting in American troops into the same environment. When you look at the costs, the dollar costs as well, it's dramatically more cost effective to work by, with, and through local partners. And as you know, that's what we talk about in terms of foreign internal defense. It's one of the areas that we've been weakest on in terms of our lessons learned since 9/11. What I would do is stop there and let the other witnesses testify, and then perhaps you may wish to pick up some issues.
Certainly. Thank you very much. Dr. Kagan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, subcommittee, and thank you also to the professional staff for being very gracious about the outrageous lateness of my testimony, and I apologize for that. I'm sorry?
Did you have the flu?
I didn't even have that excuse. I'm sorry.
Who would you give that to?
Well, I'm sure I'll have the flu now. I've been,
All right.
Customarily, when Dave and I do our traveling roadshow, we spend a lot of time saying, I agree with everything he said. And in this case, I agree with almost everything that he said, but since there are actually a couple of things that I'm not sure that I disagree with, but I would like to put a little sharper point on. I would like to start with that. First of all, there's a difference between surrogate forces and local security forces. And I think it's very important to highlight that distinction, which Dave made, but to bring that out. Surrogate forces are forces that you use instead of your own troops to fight on your behalf, pursuing your interests, as well as their own. And that's what we did in Afghanistan in 2001. I'm less pleased with the outcome of that operation than a lot of other people have been, and I have always been less pleased with the outcome of that operation because the 50,000 Afghans that we had, and Dave's absolutely right about how that war was won, unquestionably true. But the 50,000 Afghans did not form a cohesive force, could not be allowed on their own to form a government because the government would not have been legitimate, and were not, in fact, able to hold a country on their own. And there was no way that you were going to build local security forces in that context rapidly enough to fill the security gap that was created by the collapse of what little government the Taliban had been providing in time to prevent what actually happened, which is just sort of a fragmentation of the country and some renewed warlordism and, in general terms, creating conditions for some of the problems that we now face. The answer to that, of course, was not to send 500,000 American troops into the country, but it was to send some American troops and ideally international troops into the country. Because the thing to take away here is that the 20 on 1,000 population requirement for counterinsurgency is real. It is a real requirement. Dave is absolutely right that you have to count local security forces in that mix. And it's not a question of we have to put 20 troops on the ground for every 1,000 of the population, nor would it be desirable or sustainable in any sense for us to do that. But you do have to meet that requirement. Otherwise, you run the risk of real deep lawlessness that can set conditions for long-term failure, even after what looks like a very stunning success, which is what happened in 2001. And so the question is, how do we initially fill the gap between whatever exists after we've helped someone else take down a government or whatever we've done, and how long it takes actually to develop the local security forces that will be necessary? That's our exit strategy, if you will, is developing local security forces, legitimate government, civil society, and all of the things that are necessary. But we do have to have a plan for filling the security gap with our own forces and with international forces. Otherwise, you can't get there from here. And so I think that's why that leads into the point that I tried to emphasize in my testimony, which is, although we are engaged in wars against unconventional enemies, fighting irregular warfare against us, what we need to fight those wars are the conventional tools of statecraft that we actually have. We need to apply them properly. There is a lot of sort of search in this town and around the country for some sort of magic bullet that would allow us to fight our enemies without maintaining large, expensive conventional forces, and without having to deploy our troops and by using local proxies and so forth. And I know that that's not what Dave is advocating, but there are a lot of people who are advocating that. And it's distressing that a lot of arguments that we heard during the strategic pause in the 1990s about how to be a cheap hawk are resurfacing now with really virtually no changes made to them, as though the last 8 years didn't happen. And that's very distressing to me, because that didn't work. We've tried that. The problem is not that we haven't tried that. We did try that. That's what we did in 2001. That's what we did in 2003 in Iraq. We experimented with this. Small footprint, high technology, blitzkrieg, get in, get out. And the problem is that it doesn't work. And so I'm worried that we're being led down a path again of trying to persuade ourselves that there's some way to do this that's less painful. And as usual, I'm here to say, no, it's going to hurt. We need this capability to fight the kind of enemies that we face. We're going to have to pay for this capability, and there really isn't any alternative. I'd like to ask that my written testimony be submitted for the record. I don't want to recite it for you.
Sorry.
What I'd like to do instead is listen to the words of my favorite, the greatest novelist of all time, Leo Tolstoy, who said, in describing his writing process, the key is show, don't tell. And so instead of sort of lecturing you about how, general principles, I'd like to take you through the 3 map slides that I've given you to underline the point that I don't think you can actually have an abstract conversation about how to do this beyond what Dave has laid out, which is very solid and spot on. But if you're going to take it to the next level and really understand what we need to do, you actually have to put enemies on the ground in context and talk about what you're facing and how you have to deal with it. And since obviously the most significant intellectual challenge we face right now is in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I'd just like to quickly take you through what the enemy set is and talk very, very briefly about what we need to be doing about this. If you start with the first slide that's labeled major enemy groups, the point that this slide attempts to make is that we're facing 7, 8, 9, 10 significant enemy groups in Afghanistan right now, of which only about 3 actually have objectives within Afghanistan. And that would be the Quetta Shura Taliban of Mullah Omar, the Haqqani network that is now based in Miram Shah in North Waziristan, and the Hezbi Islami Gulbuddin Hig, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, which is much less significant than the other 2 and operates in the east. These are the only groups that are actively trying to achieve objectives in Afghanistan. And these are the groups that are the principal threats to American mission failure or mission success in Afghanistan right now. If we don't, in conjunction with the Afghan government and while setting up civil society and a variety of other things, defeat these groups, then we are not going to succeed in Afghanistan. The problem is these groups are very heavily focused on Afghanistan. That's really what they're focused on. And if you look at them and ask, are these major threats directly to United States national security? Are these groups going to attack us? The answer is no, that they're not. These are not global jihadist groups. These are not right now even regional jihadist groups. These are Afghan-focused groups. So why are we fighting them? We're fighting them because we need to succeed in Afghanistan. Why do we need to succeed in Afghanistan if these groups aren't trying to actively hurt us? Well, part of the answer is because we know that Mullah Omar previously provided safe haven to Osama bin Laden, is certain to do so again. Jalaluddin Haqqani has personal friendships with Osama bin Laden, invited him to his territory in the 80s, would certainly do so again. So we could have the recurrence of a safe haven, but that's a secondary concern. The real concern is that when you look across the border into Pakistan, what do you see? You see a collection of other groups that are playing in Afghanistan. They are sending fighters to Afghanistan. They're working on killing Americans in Afghanistan, but they don't actually have objectives in Afghanistan. And those groups include the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, with Ayatollah Masood's group. They include the Tehrik-i-Nafazi Shariat-e-Mohammadi, Sufi Muhammad's group, and they include the Lashkar-e-Toiba, and of course Al-Qaeda. Why are those guys fighting in Afghanistan? Well, it's a good place to kill Americans, and for those groups, it's always a good day when you can kill an American. It is live fire training for their cadres. This is where they send their troops to experience war and get blooded. They're willing to accept much higher attrition rates in training than we would be. And it's also a way for individual commanders to gain combat patches and then bid for participation in one of the shuras in Pakistan. So it's a very strange dynamic. And you could say, well, if we pulled out, then wouldn't these guys stop fighting us? Well, if we weren't there, they wouldn't be fighting us. That's for sure. And they might well lose interest in Afghanistan to some extent. But here's the thing. These are the groups that pose the principal threat to the stability of Pakistan, and if you include Lashkar-e-Toiba, to the stability of the entire region. Lashkar-e-Toiba is commonly identified as a Kashmiri separatist group, which is the one thing it is not. It is not primarily Kashmiri. It is primarily Punjabi. Its headquarters are not in Kashmir. They're in a small town called Muridke, which is near Lahore. It has something like 2,200 offices throughout Pakistan, and if you flip to the next slide, I tried to give you some idea of the major lead bases, which include a significant base in Karachi, from which parts of the Mumbai attack were launched. This is a very significant challenge to the regional and global security order, because the objective of LET is not to regain Kashmir, but to destroy India, to destroy Hindu India and sort of make the world safe for India's Muslims. That's what LET is all about. If it's allowed to proceed, it will destroy the subcontinent. That is its objective. This is a major problem for us. TNSM and TTP are much more focused on Pakistan. I know that Ayatollah Masood said he's going to blow up the White House, and I wish him luck with that. But fundamentally, these are groups that are threats to Islamabad.
You don't exactly wish him luck.
I don't exactly wish him luck. I don't wish him luck at all. Thank you for correcting.
Just for the record.
Just for the record, I wish him failure, but I'm not going to lay awake nights worrying about him doing that either. But if we succeed in Afghanistan, we have the opportunity not only to see these groups as we now can, and to interact with them to some extent as we now can, but also to influence the populations among which they exist. Because the most important bases for these groups lie in the federally administered tribal areas in Baluchistan and in the Northwest Frontier Province, apart from Let, which is another problem. And those populations are heavily influenced by what goes on in Afghanistan. As an example, we have recently, working with the Afghans, succeeded in making something of a success out of the town of Khost. Khost is the home base of Jalaluddin Haqqani. And it is a major problem for Haqqani that Khost looks like it's succeeding in the context of American and Afghan efforts. Haqqani and the ISI have said it is a priority to defeat our efforts in Khost, because if they don't defeat our efforts in Khost, it delegitimizes their movement in their heartland. Their heartland extends into Waziristan. Where am I working to with this? I reject the notion that there is some grand unified field theory of Pakistan that will get us magically to the solution of all of our problems there. I don't think there is. I think it is a vital American national security interest to work toward the stability of Pakistan. I think we need to use the instruments and opportunities that are available to us to do that. I think when you understand what the enemy laydown looks like and how the groups overlap and how the populations overlap, you can see how important it is to succeed in Afghanistan as something that we can affect directly in Pakistan, in contrast to the many, many things that we can't affect directly in Pakistan to work toward Pakistani stability. And I think your successful Pakistani strategy, at best, will end up being a composite of a variety of things that we can do and leverage that we can generate, and pressures and incentives that we can apply, put together over a long period of time to move Pakistan in the right direction. But that's why I think it is in many respects less useful to talk about general, how do we fight the unconventional war, how do we fight the global insurgency, if you will, even though I think that's a valid concept and I think those principles are important, than it is to say, let's look at a specific problem that matters most to us, and let's talk about what the challenges are, what the enemies and the threats are, and what our capabilities are. And if we do that in a number of areas, including areas that I'm not competent to talk about, like Somalia, Yemen, Algeria, Egypt, and so forth, that's the only way that you can really figure out what your force requirement is. That's the only way that you can really figure out what your large strategy is going to be, because the solution set for each one of those problems is going to be different. It's going to be based on the principles that Dave identified and some other general principles, but it will be a unique solution because each one of those problems is unique. And so what I would like to leave you with is, let's have the general conversation, but let's also talk about specifics as we think about this defense budget. And I would encourage you to press Defense Department officials and the military officials who testify before your committee and your subcommittee to speak in detail and not just offer you general bromides about how they're going to address these problems. Thank the committee.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lund, as I understand it, you're going to testify, and then Dr. Schirch is going to be available for questions.
That's correct.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for this opportunity to present some insights and ideas about a phase of conflict which does not get as much attention as the active ones. Basically, we're going to talk about what is actually going on in societies that are on early warning lists and threatened with the potential for insurgencies and terrorism or other kinds of conflict. In terms of what we've learned from these experiences, what needs to be done to make them even more effective. If you want to put it in military jargon terms, we have a chart on page 3 that came from DOD. We're talking about what is actually going on out there in phase 0, what's called the steady state, in terms of non-kinetic activities on the part of both civilian and military agencies and NGOs. And how can we use those activities, those programs, those tools to avoid getting into phase 2, 3, 4, and 5 altogether? Our first, let me say a little bit about our own experience. Lisa and I have had the privilege, I think, you might say, of going to lots of obscure, relatively obscure remote places like Tajikistan, Guyana, rural Georgia, northern Kenya, Uzbekistan, Zimbabwe, Indonesia, Serbia, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, and so on over the last several years, some of which are in active conflicts, as you know, some of which are at least show indicators of potential conflict. What we'd like to do is share some of our insights from both our direct observation as well as our research. We're both sort of half practitioner and half analysts, so we try to take an independent position vis-a-vis the various clients that we may serve at various times. The need for difficult, often deadly counterinsurgency, counterterrorism campaigns can be reduced to some extent, not completely, by targeted strategic efforts to preempt the ability of insurgent groups to capture the hearts and minds of the populations in these kinds of vulnerable societies. The typical conditions that the populations that are motivated by or concerned about are lack of daily security, absent or corrupt government services, discrimination against certain regional groups or ethnic and sectarian groups, lack of job opportunities, especially for young men, lack of any political voice, and lack of unity and great factionalism at the higher levels of the governments, as well as the addition of extremist ideologies that seem to offer a way to remedy these grievances. Addressing these factors in a very specific and targeted way through close analysis done on the ground and using a variety of actors with various kinds of programs addressing the various drivers of conflict can avoid the need for getting involved in militarily in internal wars or for a humanitarian intervention to prevent a genocide like we've seen unfolding in Darfur, as well as save the money that is spent on many post-conflict reconstruction countries. We cite some data from research that's compared the costs of wars of this type with the preventive efforts that were made in similar situations, other countries where there were risk factors evident, but preventive activities were taken, such as Macedonia. And the ratios between the costs of military efforts and other efforts compared to the preventive efforts are really incredibly great. The average in one study was 1 to 59. That is, the preventive activity costs the ratio 1 to 59, however you put that. The good news is that there are thousands of low visibility programs in mediation, governance, development, human rights, as well as track 2 diplomacy and so on in these countries from Azerbaijan to Zambia. For example, I did a study of what U.S. aid has been doing in southern Serbia in the Preševo Valley, east of Kosovo, where, as you know, there was an insurgency, an Albanian insurgency in 2001, in terms of what kind of reconciliation, what kind of building of defense against a reemergence of conflict between the Albanians and the Serbs might occur. And in several of in Preševo city itself, town itself, there are several activities that are sort of working in tandem to create a more responsive budget process in Preševo vis-a-vis that particular district, as well as at the village level, bringing together Serbs and Albanians in joint projects to do development. Those are just a couple examples of thousands of projects and programs that are going on, being carried out, not just by the U.S. government, but by the UN, OSCE, some of the multilateral organizations, regional organizations like ECOWAS, it's not, in some ways, what this hearing is bringing out is that there has not been a lot of conversation between the security communities and the development communities, so that this area called Phase 0 is basically zero. I mean, it's an unknown territory for the security community. But what I'm saying is that those of us in the peacebuilding or development communities have been actually working with a number of these sort of these programs. And there's just a lot going on there that we need to understand better and link up to a more coherent strategy. Police training, microcredit, non-armed protective accompaniment, election monitoring, civic education, disarmament, DDR activities, civil society forums, and so on. And as I say, organizations like ECOWAS, for example, in West Africa, have been quite active in mediating some of the election disputes coming up during the campaigns in places like Guinea-Bissau and so on. One doesn't read about this in the newspaper because it's not a particularly exciting information, but it's very important, and it's had its definite effects. Over these years, since the middle 90s, a number of researchers have tried to collect some of the lessons from some of these situations, and I'll just mention a couple of them, and you'll find that they're quite compatible, quite supplementary and corroborative of what has already been said by David and Fred. Among the most successful examples in the Baltics, South Africa, Slovakia, Albania, and, for example, Kenya last year, where there was fast-track diplomatic effort by the U.S. and the UN, most of them have been multidimensional in nature. That is, there's short-term diplomatic effort that's brought to bear immediately on the immediate the behaviors, the most threatening activity by high-level leaders. But there's also effort at addressing reconciliation issues and so on at the lower level among the general population. So a combination of carrots and sticks, along with dialogue, that's applied in a fairly concentrated and synchronized manner right in those situations where there's threatening clouds on the horizon, and when that's occurring. Yes.
Dr. Lund, can I ask you a specific question about that? It's actually an area that this subcommittee and I myself in particular are very interested in, the merger of sort of global development strategy with security strategy. And some of those conversations actually are starting a little bit, particularly with SOCOM and the State Department, and it is an awkward relationship. They have different sort of viewpoints on the world and to a certain degree don't trust each other, but it is beginning, and I think making that happen is absolutely critical to our security strategy, leveraging all of our national ability, from State Department, agriculture, whatever's necessary to do the development piece that you've talked about, meshing that up with some of the stuff that DoD is doing, particularly SOCOM, because SOCOM does what creeps up right to being development in a lot of areas, and how they work together with the State Department, I think, is critical. The two questions I have about that I'd like to try to address in the remainder of your testimony is, how can we better coordinate development strategy in our country? I have a very strong bias that it's hopelessly screwed up at the moment. That there's a lot of good things going on in isolation, but they are in no way coordinated and do not come together in any sort of cohesive strategy. One little sub-piece of that is the degree to which that strategy is based on a general approach to reducing poverty, which would be a good place to start, but on the other hand, meshing that with our security needs. That's where the development community tends to freak out a little bit. It's like you care more about poor people and devastating things happening in Pakistan because of security than you do in say somewhere in Latin America because you don't think you have a security interest. But we have to care about our security in terms of how we put out that money. How do you mesh that? And then beyond coordinating our global development strategy as a country, how do you see the meshing of security and global development happening? What would be the best way to develop an interagency process to make that happen so that we are working more in concert? A big challenge there, of course, is dividing up responsibilities, and trusting each other in terms of their talents. But I'm curious your thoughts on those two things. This is me kind of cheating and working in one additional question to the question time that I'll have when you're done, but if you could address that in the last few minutes.
You're not giving up your question?
No, I'm not actually, but go ahead.
Would you like us to address those questions?
If you could take a stab at it. I realize you could give an hour-long answer to that, and it'd probably be better if you could do 2 or 3 minutes.
Well,
but
and
you
maybe
hit that,
Lisa has some things to add.
Certainly.
I think you're right. The conversation has started quite actively. The particular mechanisms, formulas, and so on haven't been arrived at yet. Among the recommendations we were going to make were certainly to push that process much further, more vigorously. And we both had the experience, along with David, a couple of weeks ago, to be involved, and Mr. Natter addressed this group, a week-long simulation that was designed and organized by the Center for Irregular Warfare of the Marine Corps, that focused on a Horn of Africa scenario. And they brought together over 200 representatives of playing different roles from DOD, state, USAID, multilateral organizations like the UN, World Bank, France, Italy, UK, and so on, to sort of ask the question, how would you behave in responding to this particular situation? It was an incredibly illuminating and I thought enlightened activity in terms of what has happened in this field so far. I've been working on conflict prevention for over 10 years, and I thought this was the most coherent and on-the-case event that I've been at. And a number of recommendations came out of that which address exactly your concerns. So I would really advise.
I will take a look at that, look at those recommendations.
I don't know how much I can get into the details of exactly whether a central direction should be in the SCRS and State Department or the National Security Council. Maybe the other panelists have specific ideas of that. That event spent quite a bit of time working through obstacles in funding authorities and so on. I don't think there's a magic clear. There's a consensus that needs to be figured out. That was one of our main points. I don't think it would be that helpful for me to plumb for one approach or another.
Dr. Schirch, do you have something quickly you want to say? And then I think I will go to Mr. Miller and begin the questions, if that's okay, unless there was something else.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Smith and committee members, for inviting us here today. The field that we're talking about is conflict prevention, and this conference that the JIFCOM, Joint Forces Command, and the Marine Corps put on together was called Whole of Government Conflict Prevention. And many of us in the NGO community are working actively now to try to figure out how to build a more comprehensive approach to the issues of terrorism. And for the NGOs, we have been working actively on the ground in Iraq, Afghanistan, and we have many partner networks who are indigenous Iraqi NGOs and Afghan NGOs who have been sharing their perspective on counterterrorism and how best to prevent the spread of the kinds of insurgencies we see in these regions. And they very much want to be able to feed into the process. And part of the challenge here is that the interagency coordination is so new here in Washington that there's really no points of contact for NGOs who are on the ground, who have cultural intelligence information to share that would inform U.S. strategy. Over the weekend, Dr. Kilcullen made some statements that were in the media about the drones flying over Pakistan, bombing villages, actually having a counter effect to our national interests in the U.S., that the drones end up creating more fuel on the ground for recruitment into Taliban, al-Qaeda insurgencies. We've been hearing that in civil society and the NGOs for several years, that this kind of drone activity is counter to U.S. interests. So that's the kind of information civil societies want to give over and have conversations with the government. So it's actually very much in our interest as civil society to help to foster and think about what is the best way for the defense, development, diplomacy, tools of American power, how they are coordinated, because this impacts then how civil society can feed into the process. Again, we don't take particular stands on whether it's the State Department's Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, although we very much support that, or the National Security Council. There are a variety of models that I think we need to have more hearings on. How is this best going to be done in this country? Because it's very urgent. The ratio of cost prevention versus versus response to terrorism is not met in terms of our U.S. budget, in terms of national security. So several of us have argued for a unified security budget that would try to balance out more these preventive responses. Because right now, if you look at one tax dollar, less than 0.5% is going to all of our development activities abroad, whereas almost 60% of that dollar goes to defense approaches. So this balance is off. It makes the coordination between in this interagency process very difficult for U.S. aid at this simulation on conflict prevention. They couldn't really risk a lot of the staff time because they have so few staff to even give over to this conversation.
It also pushes DOD into doing a lot more development work than they are actually qualified to do, because they have the money. So.
And there were comments at this conference that DOD is being forced to create its own internal USAID, its own civilian response corps, which is mirroring structures that also exist in the State Department and USAID, which is a waste of taxpayer dollar.
Right. I will, one final comment, then I'll yield to Mr. Miller to begin the questioning. And the other piece about it is the NGO community just gets really freaked out about the DOD getting involved in that. A little bit of paranoia there, but part of it also is a good reason, is that when you're trying to build the type of support within a community that you need, there is a perception of the U.S. military that is different than a perception of an NGO or USAID. That in some ways makes that mission more difficult. We've had experience with that.
Another concrete answer to your question of how to move toward more coherence, coordination, is starting with a really good on-the-ground conflict assessment or field state assessment, and getting people on the same page in terms of what's going on in the situation.
Yeah.
At the country level, but also then also at the Washington or global region.
Several of those have been done, Brookings and a few other folks. But with that, I've really impinged upon my the patience of my committee members here, so I will yield to Mr. Miller. We will stick to 5 minutes as we go around. Mr. Miller.
You've only impinged on the patience of your colleague, Mr. Marshall, down here at the other end.
Yeah, he's always impatient. He's always impatient. I'm used to that.
Dr. Kilcullen, would you care to expand on your comments regarding the drone activity?
Sure. In fact, the media report on the weekend was a quote from my congressional testimony in front of the HASC, which I think some committee members may already be aware of. Since early 2006, we have conducted a number of drone strikes into Pakistani territory. In that time, we have killed 14 mid-level al-Qaeda leadership and Taliban leadership targets in that area. In the same time frame, we've killed about 700 non-combatant Pakistani civilians. That's a hit rate of about 2%, 98% collateral damage, 2% accurate hits. The strikes themselves, based on what we hear from community organizations in the FATA, are actually not particularly unpopular. There are people in the FATA who think it's actually a good thing that the bad guys are being struck. Where they are particularly unpopular is in the Punjab and Sindh, and we have seen a very substantial rise in militancy in those parts of Pakistan over the time frame since 2006. What I said to the committee last week or the week before was there is no doubt that the strikes are very, very tactically useful in disrupting al-Qaeda and in hampering their operations. Right now, because of the situation in the rest of Pakistan, they also have a downside, which is they're contributing to political instability. And what I suggested to the committee was that right now, our biggest problem is not the networks in the FATA, but the fact that Pakistan may collapse if this political instability continues. And so I suggested that we may want to return to a much more narrow targeting approach of focusing only on al-Qaeda senior leadership, only on targets that are in areas where the Pakistanis don't control the ground, and working with the Pakistanis rather than doing it unilaterally. So that's just to expand on the comments. But if you look in the testimony record from last week, there's a lot more there in that discussion.
I yield back my time and give a chance to another.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall.
Dr. Lund, the idea of prevention is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The statistic, one of, the ratio, $1 of prevention might equal $59 of cure, is very tempting. I wonder, Dr. Kilcullen, if you agree with those statistics.
I certainly don't know. I don't have any data to prove or disprove the
Whether it's
59 to 1.
59.
Yeah, but I think it's certainly true that in considering intervening in countries, we often underestimate how much time, money, and blood is going to be involved. It's a consistent pattern over all nations that get involved in counterinsurgency over the last 200 or 300 years have tended at the outset to underestimate the costs and the difficulty of the process. I think where we can, we should most certainly be working to prevent rather than to treat conflict environments. I don't think that's necessarily a sound basis for capability planning within the DoD, though. I think we need to be focusing on the military as the force of last resort and structuring it so that it can actually get in. It's like the difference between fire prevention and firefighting. You have to structure the fire department to fight the fires.
The problem that we, well, this is not new news. I mean, this has been a consistent worry of ours since World War II, actually.
Yes, and before.
When we put a lot more money into foreign aid than we do right now. And the reason we don't put as much money into foreign aid is that politically it's very difficult to sustain that in a country that has lots of other needs, and many of those needs are internal. So it's sometimes quite difficult to justify sending $1 to someplace remote that could have been spent right here on your folks. And that's an easy target for politicians. We do routinely, however, spend huge dollars through DOD on preventive measures that may or may not be essential. For example, parking large numbers of soldiers in Europe and in Korea for extended periods of time cost billions and billions of dollars. And I wonder to what extent, as you think about how we get more money into prevention, you think also about how whatever is set up can be politically sustainable, and if you look at history, you might wonder to what extent this does need to go through what is classified as national security somehow, as opposed to State Department. Because if it just goes to State Department, it's going to get ultimately viewed as feel-good, generous money that American taxpayers are sending elsewhere, when that feel-good, generous American money could be spent meeting needs here at home. And so in the long run, it's very difficult to sustain. I guess that's just an observation I've been quite concerned about. We ought to take every opportunity we can to start putting more of this money through our security side as opposed to our State Department side. And if the money goes to DOD and then somehow winds up in state, that's fine. How do you know when you need to spend $1 for prevention? It seems to me that $1 spent for prevention at the right place might be this 1 to 59 return, because we avoided having to take corrective action. But $1 spent for prevention, where? In 100 different places around the globe? And we don't really know which of those places is ultimately, if we don't spend that $1, going to wind up being something where we're going to feel like we need to take corrective action. So the ratio winds up being really, when you think about the challenge of identifying where corrective action should be, can't be 1 to 59. It's going to have to be a heck of a lot more than that. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. These are important questions. Let me answer your first one in terms of the American public, because polls of Americans have consistently shown that they support foreign aid, and they assume that we're giving much larger quantities than we are. They assume that 25% of their tax dollar is going to foreign aid. They have no idea that it's less than 1%.
It could well be that they assume that because they're outraged at the very thought.
Absolutely.
And frankly, go ahead.
When they're asked what percentage of their tax dollars should go to foreign aid, it's 10%, which is far above what we're even talking about in terms of prevention.
But it is less than 25%, so they're basically communicating that they want less spent on foreigners.
But there's an assumption.
I'm with Mr. I've been down this road 1,000 times, and That's not the best argument that I've heard
Okay.
in terms of the public for it. I respect it being made, but the bottom line is Mr. Marshall is right. The public has no idea what goes into the budget. All they know is they think too much is going in, so they want to cut. That's not as helpful as it first appears. And I'm pro foreign aid. I say it as a friendly comment,
Right,
but I
that's
think he's right.
And me too. It's just trying to figure out how to do it in a
Right.
sustainable way. And it's unrealistic, it seems to me, to think that we're going to, well, history shows it's unrealistic in a democratic political system to sustain it on just sort of feel-good stuff.
Although there's an assumption that we have a first resort, so that the defense is our last resort. And I think if Americans understood how weak our first resort is in terms of State Department and USAID, and looking at the proportions of the budget, and I often speak to American audiences where I show them pie charts of where things are going, and they're stunned at that ratio. The other thing is, in terms of choosing where we spend those preventive dollars, there is an extensive network, global network of early warning systems to identify, narrow down, prioritize those areas. So there's a recognition that we have to make choices.
We'll come back to this again if we could. I want to get to Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm reluctant to jump into this particular piece of it, but our perception is that the perception of the people in our districts think we're spending way too much on foreign aid, and it's an easy target for them. So it is tough. It is tough politically. I am impressed by the number of NGOs that are around the world and the terrific work that they're doing. I remember being in Mogadishu back in 92, 93 time frame. We were over there for Operation Restore Hope, and I was standing on the ramp out in front of my helicopter getting ready to go do something, and this man walked up, and he was an NGO, and he looked at my name tag, and it said Klein on it, and he said, Klein, he said, are you any relation to Vicki Klein? Who was my wife, and they had served together. She was an Army nurse, and they had served together some years ago, and so that's the small world thing, and they're everywhere. And there's no doubt that they have a good sense for what's going on. I'm interested in knowing how better to tap into that, but it seems to me that one thing we have here is a very serious indictment of the country teams. That we have ambassadors, we have embassies, we have people, we have State Department, and all manner of representation in these country teams who, in theory, should be able to tell us what is going on in that country, that we should be able to tell us if this is a country that maybe we need to intercede earlier, but somehow that's not connecting. So I'm not sure exactly why that is. We have, we have intelligence.
If I could just quickly, I think what the country teams would tell you, they're telling you, and they know. They don't have the resources to deal with about 5% of what they'd like to deal with.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman. If they are, then they're ineffective in the telling, because we're obviously not interceding perhaps where we should. So the system, I guess, is what I would say, Mr. Chairman, isn't working as it should.
Absolutely.
I want to go very quickly, and anybody can feel free to comment on any of this stuff, but I want to, in my couple of minutes left, I was very interested, of course, in Dr. Kilcullen's points, and I wrote down, I think there are numbers 3, 4, 6, and 7 on your list, what have to do with personnel continuity, population-centric, local security, and so forth. And going to the specifics that Dr. Kagan talked about in Afghanistan, we're in the position now of getting ready to put in the process right now, in fact, of putting in some 21,000 more U.S. forces. And there's a number of issues here that aren't matching up with your list. For one thing, these Marines are going in, and the Marines on the ground are going to be there for 7 months. Leadership will be there for a year, so we've got a little continuity problem going there. And the Commandant has told us that he has big concerns about the other 3 that I went through. They're not Afghan partners. The Afghan National Army isn't there in big numbers. The Afghan police isn't there in big numbers. There isn't a local security force. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what can we do. I mean, we're in the process of this now. I think everybody from the Commandant of the Marine Corps and General Petraeus and McKiernan and everybody across the road would like to see more interagency, and they would certainly like to see faster development of the Afghan. So a comment from anybody.
I might make a brief comment, but then defer to Fred Kagan, who knows a lot about this topic. I think that to a certain extent, what we are doing in Afghanistan is filling in the gaps in the current NATO plan. So if you look at where the NATO allies were located before the start of this Afghan surge, we're putting US troops into areas where there were not a lot of European troops to kind of fill the gap. I would argue that we ought instead to be identifying where the population lives primarily and focusing on securing the population as distinct from territory. That would be my first point. And the second point would be we need to be taking a partnering model where a US unit always operates with an Afghan military unit and an Afghan police unit.
But that's the complaint right now from the Marines is there isn't that partner unit available.
Yeah, that's right. And so they would be my two sort of points of concern about where I'm seeing things develop in Afghanistan. If I could just jump back very quickly to a previous point that you made. So there was a thing called the Regional Security Initiative that was created by the Counterterrorism Bureau in state, precisely to address this question of reporting from posts and understanding the security environment. And there's a report, the Country Reports on Terrorism, to Congress that comes every year, which actually addresses a lot of those questions as well. You may be interested in holding a hearing on that issue because there's been some very substantial development inside state in the last few years on that. And then one other final point is two big changes happened to the foreign assistance world under President Bush. Firstly, a very substantial expansion of the foreign assistance budget. In 2000, it was $11 billion. By 2008, it was $20 billion. So a lot more was being done in terms of foreign assistance. But the other big shift was that as of the end of the Bush administration, more than half of that foreign assistance was being delivered in conflict or post-conflict environments. And yet we have an aid organization that's primarily structured to do aid as a poverty alleviation tool and not necessarily well organized or conceptually well focused on operating in a conflict or post-conflict environment. I think we could do a lot to assist the USAID without necessarily spending a lot more money. It's simply helping them get their heads around the new environment that they're now operating in.
Dr. Kagan, go ahead.
Thank you. I think the last point is really critical, and I want to emphasize it. And Mr. Chairman, I was itching to make a comment on your question along those same lines. The problem is exactly as Dave said. We have, USAID. Why is USAID in state? It's in state because of the Foreign Assistance Act. Why did we have the Foreign Assistance Act? Because we saw foreign assistance as being an aspect of our public diplomacy. And because we felt, as a nation that is very generous in its international giving, we felt that it was both in our interest and ethical for us to alleviate poverty. If you ask the question, why is the system broken now, the answer is the system isn't broken from the standpoint of what it was designed to do. The system was designed to be an adjunct of our public diplomacy. It was never designed to be a major element of our national security policy. And what we have come to realize over the course of the last 8 years, which granted we should have known before, is that this kind of assistance is a critical part of our national security policy. And it ranges from everything from phase zero engagement to try to avoid conflict. And by the way, that includes military components as well. As you know, the military talks about phase zero. That doesn't mean fighting, but it does mean things that military forces can and should be doing. And it continues through conflict and post-conflict. But when we start beating up the State Department about why the country teams aren't doing this sort of thing and why the State Department isn't able to do this, this is not the State Department's job. The State Department is American. It's
Country team is much more than just State Department.
No, absolutely. And I'm not referring only to your comment. There's a tendency to beat up State about this a lot and say we really need to pound State into doing this right. And I question that. The State Department is a diplomatic service. And we need to have a diplomatic service. And the purpose of a diplomatic service is to pass paper. That's what diplomats do and have negotiations. Sorry?
Not only that.
Not only that, but primarily, you don't have a diplomatic corps to conduct major operational planning and oversee the expenditure of huge amounts of money over large areas. That's not what a diplomatic corps does. So if you're going to look for an aid organization that can be a player in national security policy, I'm not at all convinced that that should be state. And I think we really need to revisit. It's a very fundamental question you raised, sir, and I think that it really merits a lot more discussion than it's had. If I could beg your indulgence to comment briefly on the specifics in Afghanistan. I was last in Afghanistan in March of this year, and I had the opportunity to meet with the commander of the 205th Afghan Corps who's based in Kandahar, and has the fight in the south where the Marines are going to be going. And he raised a very interesting question. He said, are you Americans trying to create an expendable Afghan army or an enduring Afghan army? And what he meant by that was that we have been creating Afghan security forces, and the Afghans, have been assigning them into combat without, as Dave says, rotational periods, which also means without rest periods, which also means without relief. There is no red, amber, green training cycle in that corps. If you are assigned to the 205th Corps, you are fighting all the time until you either retire or die. And that corps has been having some retention problems, and there are a variety of other things going on. Although I supported the president's statement of his policy, and I do support it, and I strongly support it, and I think it's the right policy, I was very disappointed by one thing in his speech. He did not commit to increasing the size of the Afghan National Security Forces. And this is a big, big problem, because if you look at the 20 counterinsurgents on 1,000 ratio that you need, and you look at the population of Afghanistan, which, by the way, is an absolute swag. No one knows how many Afghans there actually are. We haven't had a census in 30 years, and this is a major problem, as Dave was alluding to. But let's say that there are about 30 million Afghans. You do the estimate, and you would need about 600,000 some odd counterinsurgents. Okay, let's cut it down and say we're not fighting in parts of the country, although I don't find that persuasive, but okay. What are we aiming at? With the current augmentation of U.S. forces, with the current planned end state for Afghan National Security Forces, by the end of 2011, we will have 316,000 forces total on the ground. Now, there are two problems with that. First is, it doesn't get you to the counterinsurgency ratio. And second is, since that's right now the permanent end state of the Afghan National Army, it doesn't give us an exit strategy. Because if we pull out, you pull 100,000 foreign troops out of there, then you're down to 216,000. So this is a problem, and it's really unfortunate that we have not focused enough on the expansion of the Afghan National Army. And I privilege that instead of the Afghan National Police for a reason. I think that we really need to consider the phasing of the development of security forces more than we have done hitherto. We want to get to an end state where you have police doing policing and not army. But in the context of a war-torn society with an ongoing counterinsurgency, right now, that's not what we're focused on in the counterinsurgency area. The Marines are not interested in local beat cops on crime. The Marines are interested in how many counterinsurgents are on the ground. If you're trying to raise a police force to be counterinsurgents, then you're not raising them to be a police force. And if you can't raise them to be a police force because the situation doesn't permit it, then you should be raising more counterinsurgents, and that means army. So what we should be doing in Afghanistan, among other things, and I agree entirely with Dave also that we are seeing gap filling with these soldiers, and we have not seen a fundamental review or revision of American strategy in Afghanistan or international strategy in Afghanistan parallel to the review that accompanied the surge in Iraq in 2007. We have not yet seen that on the ground in theater, and I think we urgently need to.
We could explore.
Yes.
Begging Mr. Thornberry's indulgence here. I want to give him a chance to ask his questions and follow up on that. We'll try to come back to this. But Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate very much the work of each of you. Dr. Kilcullen, one of the things this subcommittee has focused on a fair amount the past couple years has been what we call strategic communications. I notice in your book you use a slightly different term, but as I recall, you put some importance on the government communicating in a clear, unified way as part of dealing with this accidental guerrilla, noting that what we do talks louder than what we say, admittedly. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on where we are with that as a government and where we should go. And I'm reminded, I'm a little hazy about this, but I think the radio woke me up this morning talking about allegations that we killed a bunch of civilians in Afghanistan this morning, and the military was saying, well, it wasn't really us, it was Taliban who may have played a role. And we have investigated, we have looked in a number of instances in the past where bad guys get in a firefight with our folks, and then before we can get back to the base, they have made it look like the bad guys were in prayer and were shot in the back of the head. I mean, they are really sophisticated in this area, and it looks to me like we're playing catch-up. So I'd be interested in your views on it.
Thank you, sir. I would just make two quick comments. One is that we place a different priority within the military on information operations to the priority that our enemy places. The Taliban, as I've observed them in the field since 2006, put information or propaganda first. So the first thing they do is they decide what is the propaganda message that we're trying to send. Then they figure out what operations to design and carry out to meet that propaganda objective. We do it the other way around. We design how we're going to operate, and then at the last minute we throw it to the information ops folks and we say, hey, can you just explain this to the public? So we use our information operations to explain what we're already doing. The enemy uses their physical operations to send a message. And I think that's the fundamental shift, that mental shift that we need to make. We've tended to treat information ops as a black art and as akin to artillery planning and effects targeting. So we have people looking at it as a targeting problem. It's actually not that, it's a political maneuver problem. And in the book I get into a lot of detail about the political maneuver that we did that succeeded in eastern Afghanistan. The same would be true in Iraq. We carefully maneuvered to send a message in 2007. So I think some people, notably General Petraeus and people associated with the surge in 2007, do get this, but it's not necessarily structurally built into the US government. Some people have talked about USIA, recreating the US Information Agency, which, as you know, was disestablished in 1998, became the R Bureau within state. I think it certainly couldn't hurt, but the information environment has changed a lot since USIA was designed. It's a much more atomized and fragmented media marketplace out there. And so I think civil society is actually a very key part of this message that we're trying to send. And I would emphasize that element. And one final legislative issue, we had a lot of trouble in Iraq trying to counter al-Qaeda in Iraq propaganda because of the Smith-Mundt Act, which meant that we couldn't do a lot of things online because if you put something on YouTube and it's deemed to be information operations, and there's a possibility that an American might log onto that page and read that and be influenced by it, that's technically illegal under the Smith-Mundt Act. And so we had to get a waiver, as you may recall, to be able to do that. I think for Congress, it might be worth looking at how that legislation may need to be re-looked at or re-examined in the light of the new media environment so that it still has the same intent, but doesn't necessarily restrict us from legitimate things that we might want to do in the field.
Good point. Dr. Kagan, can I just ask briefly as my time runs out? I understand what you're saying about we need to look at each place individually, but don't we need to push increased capabilities, for example, taking this, that could be available to be tailored to each particular location?
Yes, absolutely. And the thrust of my written testimony is that anything that we do anywhere will draw from a pool of general purpose forces, both military and non-military, that has to be adequately sized. And all I'm trying to say on the specifics is the only way to size it is to basically look at each of the specific and sum them up, which is not what we do. It's a question of we've always had this discussion about threat-based planning versus capabilities-based planning or so forth. Capabilities-based planning is just a way of deciding that you are not going to look at what the actual real-world requirement is because it's budgetarily unpleasant. I don't think that's a good way to go in a world where we have active enemies who are actually shooting at us, trying to kill us every day. And I think that what we should be doing is looking at what the real-world requirement actually is by going place by place. And the military can do this and does this to some extent, although not, frankly, it doesn't sum this up in the way that it should, again, because it's budgetarily unpleasant. I don't know the civilian side of things well enough, but I strongly doubt that this is done in that coherent fashion on the civilian side. And so I don't think Congress even is being presented with the information that it needs to understand what the real-world requirement is. Now, you're not going to fund the real-world requirement at 100%, of course, because that would be tantamount to, ensuring everything so that you never can take a loss on anything, and it's unreasonable. You have to accept risk. But until you've gone specific by specific and summed that all up and looked at what the real-world requirement is, you don't even know what risk you're accepting. And in the context of the current defense budget, where it's been made clear that we will be accepting risk, but where there's been virtually no public discussion anyway of how much risk we're actually accepting and where we're accepting it, I think this is a matter that Congress should interest itself in.
Thank you. A couple observations and a couple questions. Smith-Munt is something we've looked at, and it absolutely needs to be fixed because of the way the internet works, frankly, the way other things work. I mean, you put any message out anywhere, it's going to get to an American, and Smith-Munt did not contemplate that. The problem we're going to have, and as you're lobbying and talking about this issue, is something I want to try to fix. The problem we're going to have is sort of the paranoia of the American public right now that the government's trying to manipulate them. Certainly didn't help when we had the incidents of reporters being paid. So if we open up the Smith-Munt window, and I would love to be able to open it up, make that little tweak that you talked about, because I think it definitely needs to be done. Maybe just expand the waiver ability, something. You're going to have a whole lot of folks on the other side who are going to come in and say, gosh, you know what we need to do with Smith-Munt? We need to strengthen it. We need to make sure the government's doing none of this. And I just worry that if we walk down that path, we'll wind up with more of a problem than we can handle. On the country team thing and on whether or not it's the State Department's job to sort of organize, as Mr. Klein was pointing out, let us know what's going on in the country, what the threat environment is. I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Kagan. The State Department is supposed to be about diplomacy. I think they do more than push paper, but it is diplomacy that they're focused on.
I mean that with the greatest of respect.
Understood. It's important paper that's being pushed. I think the problem that we've discovered is we've gone around, just did a trip to Africa and sort of ran through a bunch of different countries with a bunch of different problems, Yemen, Kenya, Morocco, Egypt. The problem is the ambassador or chargé d'affaires or whoever, the chief of mission, is the person who's in charge of the country. And yes, there's a lot of other people there who do a lot of other things, but they all respond to him. We're having a little bit of a problem with that actually with SOCOM and the MLEs and DOD, chain of command versus State Department chain of command. But I think Mr. Klein is essentially right that if we're going to do this sort of holistic approach to a threat environment and take a walk through the messed up world that we have and say, where do we start at that 0 point and how do we do that? The country team head has got to be the person who's, this is where we're at, okay, and this is kind of what we'd like to need done, who's orchestrating it. And then you sort of move up from the country by country level, maybe a regional organizational chart, however you do it. I think that needs to be done, and I want to let Dr. Schirch comment on this, but ask an additional question, because the other thing that struck me as we look at this, the Brookings Institute did a study on failed states. Someone else did one about the same time. And it's great. It's also like, it's like walking into your room that you haven't, picked anything up in 15 years and going, where the hell do we start? There are so many countries with so many problems, rule of law, security, even if you put aside whether or not Al-Qaeda's in there trying to recruit, just the basic governance issues. So how would we organize it both structurally, getting back to the, State Department versus, chief of mission issue, and then how would you prioritize when you're looking across one remarkably messed up globe?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The challenge of addressing failed states, which many authors have been dealing with lately, has not taken into account something that Dr. Kilcullen noted, that the capacity for doing this is largely local in these countries, and it's strengthening and partnering from the U.S. to civil society often to build the capacity of their own state.
And the Millennium Challenge Corporation, by the way, is an outstanding idea.
Absolutely.
That's another change the Bush administration made that feeds into that local approach.
If I could just give an example, particularly on the strategic communication point as well that ties in with this one. I was in Iraq in 2005 working with Iraqi NGOs, and I took a lot of taxis, I talked with a lot of people. Overwhelmingly at that point, Iraqis felt that the U.S. was in Iraq for oil and to build permanent military bases. So in terms of communicating what the U.S. interest was, there was a vast disconnect with what State Department people were saying here and what Iraqis on the ground felt. There was a large gap. And largely that was Iraqis in civil society looking at what was being done in their country and saying a lot of civilians are dying. It doesn't feel like it's about this population-centered security. At that point, I was working with Iraqi NGOs to integrate reconciliation activities into their development. So when they're giving microcredit loans, they had a precondition for a Sunni Shia business plan. They were doing very small-scale reconciliation, building security from the ground up, and being very effective at it, going from village to village, and they were a mixed NGO group of Arab, Kurdish, Sunni, Shia people all working together, going into different communities unarmed, spoke the local language, operated on security based on their relationships with people, and they were doing fantastic work all over Iraq. United States Institute of Peace, just in the last couple years, has started to empower and build the capacity of local Iraqi NGOs and civil society to run the reconciliation workshops that are now happening across the country in Iraq.
I have to ask you to wrap up because I want to give a couple of my colleagues another chance before we have to go. We have a 15-minute vote. We got another 10 minutes before we have to leave, but just give me another quick 10, 15 seconds. Then I'll
Just
call
in
up Mr.
terms of the
Boyd.
country teams, I think looking at the United States Institute of Peace and the NGO community as resources for some of these challenges.
Jim, did you have anything more? I think everybody else is fleeing, but
Yeah, I
Please,
do,
go.
actually. Dr. Kagan, I thought maybe I was seeing a reprise or a sequel to No Middle Way as you were describing what needs to happen with the Afghan army. And frankly, it's hard for me to see how we're going to have an effective enduring Afghan institutional army without having an Afghan government that's in much better shape than the current Afghan government is. And I don't see how the Afghan government's going to get into a much better position than it is right now. Just the corruption and other challenges that they've got are enormous. But I'm fascinated and would really like to explore your thoughts about this sort of divide between the appropriate responsibility given to state historically, more than just pushing paper, and what we now recognize should be done. In part because of repeated comments from folks like Dr. Lund and Dr. Schirch. I mean, we all know this, that an ounce of prevention can really avoid a pound of cure, and that pound of cure comes at huge cost in terms of lives and limbs for Americans and others. And I don't necessarily agree with the chairman's sort of summary that it has to all be controlled, or that the driving force, the guiding light has to be the country team, unless country teams wind up getting redefined, it just seems to me. And I'd really like you to talk a little bit more about if you've already had some thoughts concerning how we might reorganize. You've heard me say, I've said this many times, I'm absolutely convinced we won't fund it as long as it stays in state and it's described as the historic diplomacy mission. We're just not going to do that. It's unrealistic to think we will. Political history is completely against the notion that we will. So what's our alternative to get the appropriate funding to have the ounce of prevention?
Let me start by clarifying the remark that I know is going to come out of this meeting. In full disclosure, my sister-in-law is a former ambassador, and I'm very familiar with what ambassadors do. And that actually wasn't trying to denigrate the State Department at all, but simply to say there are things that they are designed to do and things they're not designed to do. And the issue isn't so much with the ambassador, actually, and I want to make this point, and that's why I gave you the full disclosure. The issue, ambassadors can, especially professional foreign service officer ambassadors, can be, and many of them are, capable of thinking about these things and trying to do the right thing. What they rarely have is the right kind of staff to do planning, intelligence gathering, intelligence assessment, planning, and so forth.
And beyond their capability, sorry to interrupt here, because I take Mr. Marshall's point, beyond their capability, their responsibility within our flow chart, if we want to change that flow chart, we can change it. But if the whole thing is by, through, and with, okay, you work with the local population, whether it's on development or counterinsurgency, the ambassador is our representative in that country. If anything goes on in that country done by the United States of America that he doesn't know about, he or she is rightfully pissed off and completely undermined in their ability to do their job, the job that we have assigned that person to do. That is my only point, but go ahead.
So I think one of the questions is how are the missions staffed, and missions need to be staffed differently in different places. One of the things that sends shivers up my spine more than anything else are the discussions that you hear in the corridors of the new embassy complex in Baghdad about the need for the embassy to return to normalcy. by which is meant a normal diplomatic representation with some sort of foreign assistance. That's insane. It's not a normal situation, and the ambassador in Iraq is going to continue to have to do things beyond the norm, but there's an institutional bias within state that drives against creating the structures that are necessary to do this. How do we fix it? Look, in the short term, the reason this is going into the military is because the military is the only organization that is capable of doing this for two reasons. One, and the most important, is because the military does have the capability to put together planning staffs, to develop intelligence analysis, plan, conduct, and execute operations on this scale. And we don't have country teams on the whole that can do that, with a handful of exceptions. And that's probably going to persist for some time. So in the short term, I doubt that there is an alternative to putting this kind of resource through the military in areas where we have troops present, in countries where we have a very active military assistance program, and so forth. In the long term, I can't tell you what the structure should be. I can tell you what it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be what we have. And nor is there going to be a simple fix like making aid a cabinet post or something, or pulling it out of the flow chart. Because what we have to do, look, we do want aid to be a part of our public diplomacy. We do give foreign assistance for that reason. We do want to alleviate poverty. We do give assistance. We don't want to stop doing that. But we also can't have aid as a national security tool beholden to those principles as it is right now. So I suspect that the long-term fix for this is going to require two separate organizational structures, either within one aid organization, although I'm skeptical of that, or in two separate organizations. And I would say, I don't see that it matters whether this is housed at DOD or state or somewhere else. And I think that we need to get over the allergy to making this a DOD function. There are lots of things that are DOD functions that could be done elsewhere. And I agree with you that if you want this to be funded, but I would say even more importantly, if you want this to be integrated well into our national security strategy and executed well as part of that, integrating it into DOD is probably the best long-term solution. But this is something that I think it really merits very, very serious study, and much more serious study than it's received. I'm sorry, I can't offer you more specific than that.
And I would just say, I mean, I think the bottom line is it's an interagency approach. It has to be an interagency approach. No one agency is going to be in charge. The key is how do they cross over.
There's definitely exceptions to how the country teams relate to these issues. And it's been enough years so I can sort of say this. In Zimbabwe, USAID was keeping its own sort of early warning grid for some years and not letting the ambassador know they were doing it, because they felt that maybe, you know, he'd want to take it over, he wouldn't do it right, and so on. But they were, I mean, this was 7-8 years ago, before the crisis really grew. And adjusting their programs as much as they could to these drivers of conflict. In Mindanao, you've got the ambassador and the USAID administrator just like this in southern Philippines. A lot of programs pushed into Mindanao over the last 7-8 years. Quite integrated, quite strategically targeted, and so on. They need a little tweaking here and there, but linked up with the military aid to the Philippine Marines, and in local areas working in Basilan, for example, working in tandem with each other, more or less. So it really is where the leadership can be carried out. So I think maybe the security rubric is really important overall, is the overall. But the fact that you could save money. I mean, isn't that have some marketability these days?
We've always known that.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I mean, this is not new news. We have known this for, generations, and we still have a problem politically sustaining it. So from a strategic perspective, that's all I'm offering here, is a sort of oversight. Somebody needs to think through how this is sustainable, because this problem is not going away for the foreseeable future as weapons become more sophisticated and available retail.
Dr. Kilcullen wants to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer your gesture. So one of the things that we did towards the end of the Bush administration, which was actually signed off on by the Secretaries of State, Defense, and the Administrator of Aid just before the inauguration, and I believe has received support from the Obama administration as well, was we produced an interagency counterinsurgency handbook designed for policymakers at the higher level in the legislative and executive branch. And in that, we talked about something called a mission augmentation team, which is a small team that goes into an embassy that has one of these situations of a developing insurgency or a conflict prevention and is specifically tailored to support that country team in exercising the responsibilities that you're talking about. So we have approved a structure to actually do that. I don't know if the current State Department leadership plans to go ahead and develop that fully, but it's there, it's approved, and it's something that we may want to look at to build this capacity that you're talking about. In writing that handbook, we went into a lot of detail on prevention, and we also now have interagency agreement on some of the prevention issues that are required. So a lot of the intellectual foundation is there. The problem I would go back to is, state is the size of an army brigade. You know, it's 6,000 to 8,000 people. And it's just not big enough to do a lot of this stuff. It needs to be bigger and better resourced. And I know Fred was being a little flippant, but, you know, the reason that we managed to get the CIA into Afghanistan 27 days after 9/11 was the State Department. Basing, overflight, fuel supply, diplomatic clearance, preventing the Russians and the Iranians from interfering. That was all State Department. State Department work, diplomacy is like air support. You don't walk down the street in Baghdad and look to your left and see an airman providing air superiority and to the right and see a diplomat, but you can't operate without those two guys.
Right.
We got to run, could talk about this for a great deal of time. You've all been very, very helpful. I think this is critical. Didn't even get into the questions about the budget, how we go forward on this and how we plan for implementing the strategy. But obviously this has come out from our conversation here, and it's not just the DoD budget. I mean, it's the whole budget, and I like the idea of sort of a holistic security approach across agency lines in terms of how we put together the budget. And I think there's some good ideas there. And then, of course, there are tough choices involved. And everyone's always very good in government at telling you where we should spend the money. It's getting those people who say this is where we shouldn't spend it that is always the challenge. But thank you. And certainly this committee wants to stay in touch with all of you. I think you have very important knowledge and insights on this critical subject. So thank you for your testimony. And we are adjourned.